Hello and welcome back to another JOM interview podcast series with me, Rajinder Bandal. The intention here is to celebrate and showcase the fact that academic research informs practice and that likewise practitioners inform academia. This JOM session focus is on a study entitled Emphasizing Worker Identification with Skills to Increase Helping and Productivity in Production, a field study, authored by Henrik Frank, Daniel K. Kaznica, Jan Schmut, and Torbjörn Netland. Incidentally, this study has a state-of-the-art, really groovy methodology in the title. So stay tuned to hear more on that throughout the session. And in fact, the authors, Henrik and Daniel, are with us, as is Daniel Finkenstadt, aka Fink, in our practitioner chair. So authors, welcome to the session. So what motivated you to pursue this rather novel study?
Thank you so much, Rajinder. Thank you for having us on the podcast. Well, this field experiment is set up in a pretty special company, a company that has created a lot of transparency in their production for their shop floor workers using smartwatches. So that creates new opportunities, but also new challenges. And one of the challenges is that people see tasks that pop up, so work that needs to be done, but sometimes they don't actually go and do it. So our project is about collaboration and how to enhance collaboration among people that work in such a digital factory.
That's brilliant.
Maybe also on a bigger picture. So we've been working with this company for over 4 years now. And one thing that we continuously observed was when they introduced new technology, when they introduced new features of the smartwatch technology that Henrik mentioned, there were always some behavioral issues. And that was the interesting part because managers often thought that they're going to face technical issues with new technology, but they actually handled that quite well. And it was more of the workers and some behavioral implications that where the real challenges were. And yeah, that was a big motivation also for this study on a bigger picture.
I really like that idea there, Daniel and Henrik, of perception, as you mentioned. Typically, phones are not allowed in the workplace, but now we're getting used to having phones or indeed smartwatches that communicate vital knowledge in that domain. I just want to bring Fink into this. Fink, what are your thoughts with using technology as an enabler to enhance skills, or indeed bring skills to the mindset of the people who are using machinery, complex machinery, to produce quite often complex products?
Hey, Rajinder, thanks. Yeah, so I think it's valuable. I think it's valuable to give people information to help them do their job. But I think when the authors, when Henrik and Daniel are talking about behavioral things that came up, you have to understand the way that humans behave with information, right? So it's like when you're tracking things, especially with technology, the first thought of most workers, from my experience, is what are you going to do with that information, right? So now you're seeing like in this study, like which machines are going down and which people have skill sets that can go and handle that. How is that being observed by management and leadership and stuff like that? And that'll drive my behavior. And it's not just the interaction with management, but it's sort of the peer group as well, which is, all right, they're also observing my peers. So how does my response to this technology, this signal, how does that get observed by leadership relative to my peers? Right. And so that drives a lot of behaviors that you might not necessarily think, especially if leadership, in my experience, doesn't communicate the intent of the digital transformation of the digital tool. Right. So maybe it is just simply this is an aid to help you. But it depends on all the previous behaviors that leadership has manifested before that to see if the workforce actually believes it, because they might go, that this looks more like a tracking mechanism. So we're going to behave a certain way. So I think that can have a lot of like unintended consequences. It doesn't mean that it's not useful. I think it just means that you can't detach human communication from digital transformation. And it's what we see over and over again, especially right now with the big push for AI and people realizing that you can't just sprinkle AI on stuff and walk away and get rid of all the humans. It doesn't work that way. And so I think what I saw with this study is maybe counterintuitive to the intent of the technology, but not counterintuitive to what I would expect people to do in behavior aspects.
That's really insightful. Although, can this be perceived as potentially a bottom-up approach towards scooping up that knowledge, those skills, and bringing it to the attention of managers? Or indeed, is this a question of, with a little help from my friends in that particular setting of the factory floor, that we can work together, communicate, have that sense of team camaraderie spirit to maybe overcome any challenges, or indeed ask new questions? And I'm going to take this back to the authors. Do you have a similar take on this?
Yeah, Henrik, do you want to go first, or
So what Fink is referring to, I think, hits the nail on the head. This would take us back 3 years in this collaboration. Indeed, it's a lot about trust. It mattered a lot how the new technology was communicated. And at the stage where we were able to run this field experiment, it was already quite well integrated into the organization. People had the right idea of it, less as a control mechanism, but more as a tool that actually helps them. So there's a lot of few little features that workers really appreciate. So they don't have to walk long routes to a computer to input some new measurement data, for example. And these are all the things that are necessary, I think, prior to our study to make people accept this new technology. So that's a really good point.
And there's also, I think, other things that you mentioned, Fink, I can also see. I think there's a lot of topics that are also in the future potentially of interest that deal with trust. Also, especially in the peer group. I think the relationship between managers or leadership and workers, it's hierarchical, right? And people kind of know what to expect from one another. But within the peer group, it was very interesting because out of or suddenly your work becomes more transparent. Also, your performance may become more transparent to your peers, because before that era, you could still say, hey, I did a lot of work today, and no one really knew if that was true or not, but let's give you the benefit of the doubt. And so that also caused a lot of trouble within the peer groups, because you could finally see, who's like just having the fifth coffee of the day, and who's running from one machine to the other. So I think trust and accountability and responsibility, these are all things also, especially with AI now, that I think are also of interest in doing research in.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I just want to add, I think that, there's an assumption that of like good behavior here, I guess, which is like, given the right information and the right, motivation, everyone's going to be helping, right? There's this idea of picking up slack. Having worked in plants and families that work in plants for a very long time, that is not the case in many cases. So there's things such as like skill hoarding, skill outsider issues, right? Which is like you aren't a tech expert in pressing or mold injection or whatever, so therefore we're not going to help you, right? You're not on the inside. The other one is maybe this is a group of folks that aren't upwardly mobile, right? So there's not a lot of room for progression. So keeping yours is really, really important, right? Which means that you don't want to share and you don't want to differentiate, because you are the one that understands this, this milling machine or whatever, right? Or Milwaukee milling machine. So, I mean, I think that my observation, I actually have family members right now who production numbers wise, in a bearing plant, exceed all their metrics and are the top performer. And I know from talking to them weekly, there is a consistent effort to undermine their performance by everyone in their peer group, right? So that even when it comes to like bringing up things that don't even matter at the job, and that's very common. I worked as a CNC machinist making air compressors for a while, and I advanced really quickly, and I had that exact same thing happen, which was I moved from just like, you know, cleaning parts to tumbling parts. So eventually I was taking over a CNC machine from someone who wanted to do that, who'd been trying for like a year to get it. And it was met with a lot of like communication shut down, would not help me in any way and stuff like that. And so, you know, you cannot automate and digitize out the human behavior aspect, right? And so it's so interesting. I think there's a lot here with like continuing on looking at, given this extra information, how does that impact skill hoarding and stuff like that?
Yeah,
I think
that's
that
actually
is
a great point that you have there, especially with skills. And that's maybe one last thing that I wanted to mention is that out of a sudden, workers became so strategic about their skills because now they're codified in the system. So what does that mean? The more skills I acquire, the more work I have to do potentially, because you know the system will check eventually, hey, who has the skill to perform a certain type of work and who's available. So out of nowhere, people kind of became strategic and they thought, hey, if I get one more skill, then maybe I have to do a lot more work in the future. But as there weren't any like salary bonuses or whatsoever, obviously people became very strategic about these things, and that was also very interesting to see during our time with the company.
Yeah, I think incentives and things like if the work is unionized or is formalized in some way where it's harder to fire people for things like that. I work in government, and I can promise you, I can tell you what the majority of people would do if they thought they were going to get more work, is they would avoid that, right? Like and then there'll be like that top 15-20% that goes after it, right? That wants it, and guess what? They get everything, right? They carry the load for everyone, right? And that's just consistent behavior that you see in large organizations, especially those where the HR system makes it very difficult to let go of people or to downgrade people.
This is fascinating insight, Henrik, Daniel, and Fink. Thanks for your contributions there. But when you consider manufacturing, it's a complex sector, and particularly this setting, this field experiment. That the organization, produces millions of complex parts, and there's machinery. So, what is the initial findings of the research that may help inform organizational culture? If you look at this from an experiential setting, you have people that work there for a number of years, can have a lot of knowledge, skills. What are the key findings?
I think one of the main points is to shift the mindset away from what is the ownership of between the worker and the machines, because that really restricts collaboration. And it's a common heuristic that I think pretty much all manufacturing organizations use, because they allocate workers to machines. But with digital technology, we don't need this allocation. And with this new situation, and that's one of the main takeaways, skills as a thing that identifies me, that defines me as a worker, it's maybe a more useful element than the machines. But we also found in a study that these two types of identification, so machines and skills, are both part of a worker, and they're really hard to disentangle. So that's one of the main takeaways for future research.
So, in other words, the self-concept, the way people assign meaning to their own job, the machine, this emotional attachment, identification, and as it comes out through the paper, these helping behaviors, or maybe organizational citizenship behavior is something to expand on further. Think, what are your
Absolutely.
thoughts?
It's
Brilliant.
oh, sorry for jumping in. It's a whole bunch of concepts. And what we, when we talk to the practitioners, always refer to is what do you think of when you walk through the factory gate? That kind of boils it down.
That's interesting. And I think I just want to tap on something that you mentioned before with this idea of ownership or working with particular machines. And it sort of reminds me of this idea of group versus out-group interaction, in-group, out-group interaction, where somebody may be ostracized in that sense. But that's not essentially going to be helpful for the longer term company vision. When you look at it's an organization, they're producing parts to go to an end consumer. So really we're starting with the grassroots, which are the people.
Indeed, there's a lot of challenges in the technology. That was actually part of the reviewer feedback we got, to also consider these challenges more. In this study, we can say that there was a nice side effect. The treatment that we administered, so highlighting the skills, the importance of skills, actually reduced ratings of emotional exhaustion. So that was a nice side effect here.
Yeah, and I think referring to in and out groups, I think with the technology, at least for me as someone external, it made it a little bit more difficult to differentiate between what is the in group and what is the out group. Because before the technology, it was quite clear. And that's what I meant also with maybe accountability and responsibility. Before the technology, certain workers were assigned to a certain set of machines. So it was crystal clear. Today I'm going to work on machine XYZ. And this could be considered my in group. Maybe I have another person that helps with these machines. So this would be the in group. But now with the technology, or enabled by the technology, workers were basically nudged to work everywhere, wherever their skill is needed. So it makes it also much more difficult to understand what the in and out group is.
That's brilliant. And let's now consider the fact that factories of the future probably have an element of digitization. In fact, that's probably increasing. What can we expect from future work, future research, and what should the focus be on here? And this is to the authors, Henrik and Daniel.
I think maybe if we're talking specifically about this work, is to find out how to push one feature of workers' identity and not touch another. So how to change identification of factory workers. It's really challenging. We were able to change it a slight bit over the course of our field experiment, but future studies will for sure have to look into the long-term effects of this. And if we want to zoom out on a larger scale, I think it's analyzing changes of digitalization, like changing routines on shop floors through digital technology, just like what Daniel was referring to, opening up that in-group to such a radical extent. This could be a great example of a future study.
Yeah, and then I think on a even bigger picture, I think Fink mentioned it also earlier. I think we all know, and we actually still work with the company that we did this study with. And of course, just like any other company these days, they're also pushing for more and more AI also in their technology. And I think what we also see on the shop floor, and also talking to managers and leadership, there's also a huge shift in human agency coming with using especially AI. And I think that's also something that we look more and more into now, maybe potentially through further field experiments that we're trying to set it up, but obviously takes some time sometimes. Yeah, I think that's definitely something that I guess many factories of the future will face. And I think maybe that's also a great thing about this company, or about our case, that it's quite unique from what I've seen from many other factories. And then what they're facing is something that also other practitioners will face in their efforts of digitalizing their manufacturing operations.
That's brilliant, and I really love the way in the methodology this particular field experiment is between a factory in Germany and Italy, and it would indeed be interesting to see how this plays out if it was a repeat experiment in, for instance, Asia or India or another country where, for instance, you have different cultures. And also, I really like this idea of a sense of belonging, this notion of job satisfaction, job motivation, which is also coming out through. But talking about cultures, sometimes you have those cultures that are quite interdependent, independent. So it would be interesting to see that. Think, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think from a future study standpoint, I think there's a lot that needs to be done in digital transformation in general, but definitely when you're talking about operations, with figuring out the right, number one, the right metrics and signals that need to be used in the technology, because there's, the quintessential book like Measure What Matters, right? But what we talk about a lot in my military background is like making the metrics the mission, right? And that's the risk, right? Is if the metrics become the mission, then you've kind of lost sight of what you're doing. And so that is a risk with digital technology, right? As you start to visualize signals of what's happening on the floor, then what's happening on the floor matters less than the signals, right? And everybody starts trying to manage the visual metric. And I think that's a thing for management that they have to think about. You also have to think about how do we measure and reduce friction for injecting these technologies into the process, right? So both adoption and daily use. I see a lot of enabling technology that comes into like just business processes, forget production process, but just business processes that come in and developers come in and say, hey, if you'll just sit down to this 2 or 3 hour training on this software platform, we'll be able to use it. And my answer is usually like, if I have to go through 2 or 3 hours of training, I don't want it because it's not seamless. It's not integrated. Like I open up Outlook or Google Mail, they're different, but it's pretty quick. Within 15 minutes, I know what I'm doing, right? Like if you can't build something that seamless and ubiquitous in the digital space, then you're injecting added labor. And what's going to happen is there'll be employees that are incentivized and sort of, given accolades for being able to manage the digital technology well, which is not the mission of your organization. The mission of your organization is to produce heat treated parts or whatever it is, right? Or to press out bearings. And if you start incentivizing and promoting and loving the people who can manage the digital technology the best versus the ones who can actually produce the part that gets you money. And I think that's a discussion and for studies is, as you introduce these digital technologies, do they become support to the organization or do they become the master of the organization? And in my experience, that is a product of digital literacy within the organization. So I think if you have a digital native, digital literate organization, they understand the end goal and they don't become overwhelmed by managing the digital technology in the process. It's just sort of seamless to them. I also think that they reject digital technologies that don't work with low friction, right? Whereas as those who are less digitally literate are slower to adopt these technologies. And when they do, they're not literate enough to know what seamless looks like or what, a good solution is for their end mission, their end goal. And so they adopt suboptimal digital technology and then spend most of their time trying to get good at managing that technology versus being better at doing their job. And so I think there's a lot of richness there to study to see like what are the unintended consequences and then sort of a moderating effect of like what's the relative digital literacy of the organization or the workforce that's about to adopt the technology before we adopt it, and then seeing that across different groups, right? Like does digital literacy a priori, have an impact on behavior down the line and then production outcomes and stuff like that.
I think that is absolutely fascinating. And I love the way that notion of technical transition is sort of impacting individuals' behavior, both positive, maybe a negative. And I'm just thinking the emotions might come out positive versus negative emotions, and obviously aligned with self-identity. This is not my machine, this is not my expertise or my skills, therefore, or vice versa in a more positive tone. And I really like, one thing I really like in the paper is that there's this notion of skills on smartwatches, as it were. And you'll have to read the paper to find out more about this skills matrix, which I think is fascinating. Daniel, what would you like to say on the skills matrix there?
Yeah, it is quite fascinating, and I'm also excited about how the skill matrix will evolve. I think a skill matrix is something that every production organization has. Most of them have it maybe in Excel or maybe even on a piece of paper, so you know what skills your workforce has. But I think what's interesting in our case, what we realized is that and that's actually also a really great point for future research, maybe, or some interesting points in the future that we could look at. So skills right now are often codified as yes or no, 0 or 1. I can either do it or I can't do it. But when we talk to the workers, it's interesting that we can see there's people have nuanced skills. So some uh, um, they're really highly skilled in one certain machine or in one certain process in one certain task, and someone else that where the skill matrix also says he or she has that skill, um, is maybe not as skilled as this other person. And I think that's something that the technology could not so far, like that tacit knowledge that I want to get to, uh, could not be represented in the technology or in the skill matrix as it is today. Um, but I think what also this company wants to do is that maybe you have a self-learning system at some point using, for instance, AI that actually learns through the data it gets on a daily basis which worker has which skills and also what kind of level of a certain skill. And I think that's also something for the future that maybe if there's a better distinguishment between how skilled workers really are, maybe also some of the studies that we did or that are already out there on skills can be looked at again. Because I think right now with pen and paper or just a simple Excel file where we say yes or no, that's black or white, but let's say there's a lot of shades of gray in between. And if technology enables us to see these differentiations, then that would be pretty cool, I think, in the future.
That's brilliant. It's been fascinating speaking to you, Henrik and Daniel and Fink. Thanks for your contributions. So that wraps up our discussion on skills. Well, the future is skills on the factory floor with smartwatches. That's what I see, and I'm looking forward to further research and looking forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you so much for having us.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.